The last thing I expected at my college graduation dinner was the sight of my mother's face literally melting. In one horrific moment, my boyfriend, Mason, threw a container of industrial cleaning solution at her, and the world dissolved into screams. But as my father tackled him to the ground, Mason's words cut through the chaos, revealing a truth far more terrifying than the violence I had just witnessed. He wasn't just attacking her, he was trying to stop her from erasing me from existence. The celebration was supposed to be the triumphant culmination of my life's work, a dinner to mark my graduation and my imminent entry into medical school. The restaurant was elegant, the kind with crisp white tablecloths and waiters who moved with a silent, practiced grace. My family was all there, their faces beaming with a pride that felt like a warm spotlight. My father, my uncles, and my mother, Linda, who looked so much like me that we were often mistaken for twins. And next to me, holding my hand under the table, was Mason. His grip was clammy, his smile strained, but I attributed it to the formal setting and the pressure of meeting my extended family. I had no idea that in his pocket, he carried a bottle of industrial-grade cleaning solution, a chemical weapon that was about to turn our celebration into a federal crime scene. The moment is seared into my memory like a brand. 1 second, my mother was lifting a glass of champagne to toast my future. The next, Mason was on his feet. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, and before anyone could react, he had uncapped the bottle and flung its contents directly into my mother's face. The restaurant did not just erupt into chaos, it fractured. The sound that ripped from my mother's throat was not human. It was a raw, primal shriek of agony as she collapsed, her chair toppling backward. Her skin began to bubble and hiss, peeling away from her skull in grotesque, melting sheets, as if she were a wax figure held to a flame. I was frozen, a statue of disbelief. I couldn't process it. My mind simply refused to accept the reality of what my eyes were seeing. Mason, my gentle, kind Mason, had just dissolved my mother's face. My father, a man I'd never seen raise his voice, let alone his hand, launched himself across the table with a guttural roar. He tackled Mason to the ground, his fists a blur of motion as he rained blow after blow onto Mason's face. I tried to scream, to add my own voice to the pandemonium, but my throat was a locked vice. I could only watch, paralyzed, as the woman who gave me life was unmade before my very eyes. She's been stealing Beatrice's identity for 3 years. Mason's voice was a desperate, choked shout as he tried to shield his head from my father's furious assault. 2 of my uncles piled on, pinning Mason's arms, their expensive suits instantly stained as they slipped in the spreading pool of blood and chemical sludge on the floor. She's been using their identical resemblance to drain her bank accounts. My legs finally gave out, and I crumpled into a nearby chair, the world a dizzying, nightmarish swirl. My father paused for a fraction of a second, his fist poised in midair, a moment of hesitation that Mason seized. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the polished floor. My mother was writhing, a thrashing, convulsing figure of pure agony, knocking over tables and leaving horrifying smears of her own flesh on the pristine white linen. "I have video of her at 5 different banks," he yelled, his voice strained over my mother's inhuman wails. He tried to hold up his phone, but one of my uncles twisted his arm back with a sickening crack. "I found discrepancies in Beatrice's accounts when we were apartment hunting. I installed tracking software on her phone. I've caught her stealing over $40,000. My mother writhed on the floor, trying to form words, but she only managed to spray a fine mist of blood across a tablecloth as her face continued its horrifying transformation. And even through the carnage, through the ruined flesh and exposed bone, I saw a look in her one remaining eye that made my stomach clench into a knot of ice. It wasn't denial. It wasn't confusion. It was pure, unadulterated rage at being caught. "Those accounts are family money," she finally shrieked, the words warped and monstrous, slurred through her melted mouth. "Mom," I whispered, the sound lost in the cacophony of diners screaming, staff crying, and the frantic dial tones of a dozen calls to 911. My mother's face just kept bubbling, peeling away like cheap plastic in a fire. My father, his hands now slick with my mother's blood and skin, wrenched the phone from Mason's grasp. He stared at the screen, at the crystal-clear ATM footage of a woman who looked exactly like me, wearing my favorite blue coat, calmly withdrawing cash. His face, already pale, turned a ghostly shade of white. "Linda, you've been stealing from our daughter?" he asked, his voice a broken, incredulous whisper as she convulsed on the floor, her screams a constant, terrible soundtrack. She owes me everything. My mother managed to hiss between shrieks, blood and liquefied tissue dripping from what was left of her chin. I gave up my career to raise her. I gave her this life. The other diners were plastered against the far walls, a horrified audience, their phones held up to record the macabre spectacle. The restaurant manager was openly vomiting into a potted plant in the corner. Servers were huddled together, sobbing uncontrollably. And I felt like I was drowning, the air thick with the acrid smell of chemicals and burned flesh. My own mother had been methodically dismantling my future, and now her face was literally falling off in front of a captive audience. You destroyed her face over money? My father screamed at Mason, finally releasing him and scrambling backward, his shoes slipping in the grotesque puddle on the floor. Even if she stole from Beatrice, you threw acid at my wife. Mason, his nose clearly broken and his lips split open, wiped a smear of blood from his face. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, chilling intensity that made my blood run cold. That's not why I had to destroy her face, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an incredible weight. In that instant, a hush fell over our immediate circle. The only sounds were my mother's pathetic whimpering and the sickening, sizzling sound of her skin. I heard my own voice, thin and reedy, ask the question that hung in the air. What do you mean, that's not why? I followed her yesterday, Mason said, his gaze locked on mine. To a P.O. box. Check her purse. A new wave of shrieking erupted from my mother. She began to crawl, dragging herself toward her handbag which had fallen near the table, leaving a gruesome trail of dissolved flesh in her wake. But my father was faster. He snatched the purse and dumped its contents onto the floor. Amidst the lipstick, keys, and wallet, a small, unassuming glass vial rolled out. That's ricin, Mason stated, his voice now deadly calm, a stark contrast to the swirling chaos around us. She was going to poison Beatrice at the mother-daughter spa trip you had planned for next week. Then she was going to take over her life completely. The world spun, and I leaned over and vomited onto the white tablecloth. You were supposed to die quietly, my mother screamed at me, her voice a horrifying soup of rage and pain. After you were gone, I was going to be you. Live as you, graduate medical school as you. We're identical. No one would ever know the difference. She's already been preparing. Mason gasped, blood still streaming from his battered face as the first wail of sirens pierced the night. She's memorized all of Beatrice's friends' names. She's been recording your voice for months, practicing your laugh, your accent. She's already redirected your mail to that P.O. box, changed the emergency contacts at your medical school, so only she would be notified if something happened to you. My father dropped to his knees in the pool of his wife's blood. The foundation of his entire life, his marriage of nearly 30 years, had just been demolished. I had to destroy her face, Mason repeated, his eyes pleading with me to understand as the restaurant doors burst open and police officers swarmed in. Their weapons drawn. It was the only way. The only way to make sure she could never, ever pretend to be you again. The scene devolved into a controlled frenzy. Paramedics in tactical gear rushed to my mother's side, their faces grim, while two officers roughly hauled Mason to his feet. Wait, I screamed, the single word tearing through my paralyzed throat, but they were already dragging him towards the exit, my mother's shrieks echoing from the stretcher she was being strapped to. There's more, Beatrice, Mason yelled, struggling against the officer's iron grip. About your father. About what she's been doing to him, too. The police were shouting commands, pushing witnesses back, creating a perimeter. A heavily armored officer grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the table. Another was yelling about hazmat protocols, pointing to the vial of ricin. They wouldn't let me near my father, who was being questioned by a stern-looking detective. They kept asking me if I had touched anything, if any of the liquid had splashed on me, while crime scene technicians in white suits began to meticulously bag every item on our table: plates, glasses, silverware, my purse. My hands were shaking so violently I felt like my bones were rattling. When a female officer asked for my name, it took me 3 attempts to force the syllables out of my mouth. The hazmat team arrived, otherworldly figures in their sealed white suits and respirators. They unfurled rolls of yellow crime scene tape, cordoning off the entire restaurant, their cameras flashing as they documented the chemical burns seared into the floor. They made us all strip down to our underwear, right there in the middle of the dining room, our humiliation a sideshow to the main horror. We were given thin paper scrubs to wear while our clothes, our beautiful graduation outfits, were sealed in biohazard bags for testing. I watched them place my brand new dress, the one I had saved for months to buy, into a plastic bag and label it as evidence. A woman with short, no-nonsense gray hair and a detective's badge approached me. Her name was Caitlin Haynes. She was the lead investigator. Her voice was calm, a steady anchor in the swirling sea of trauma. She explained that the entire scene had to be processed, that full statements would come later, but she wanted me to know who was in charge. The smell of burned flesh and acrid chemicals was an almost physical presence, and her calm professionalism was the only thing keeping me from completely shattering. My mother was loaded into a specialized ambulance for burn victims. Detective Haynes arranged for me to be transported to the hospital for decontamination. In a separate ambulance, an EMT kept checking my skin for any signs of chemical burns, his flashlight tracing patterns on my arms and face. At the hospital, the ordeal continued. I was forced to shower 3 times with a harsh, antiseptic soap while nurses monitored me. They checked every inch of my body with a black light. They were kind, their voices soft as they told me I was safe, but I felt disembodied, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's life. My father arrived, still spattered with my mother's blood. He was rushed into a separate decontamination unit. I sat alone in a sterile room, wrapped in a paper gown, waiting for the next horror. An hour later, a man in a dark suit arrived. He was Agent Joshua Carr from the FBI. The discovery of ricin, he explained, had elevated my graduation dinner to a federal case. We were now dealing with attempted murder and the possession of a chemical weapon. The restaurant was officially a federal crime scene. Detective Haynes and Agent Carr began their questioning. They asked about Mason, about our relationship, about any financial issues I'd noticed. I told them about the apartment hunting, about Mason's strange fixation on my bank statements, his muttered concerns about discrepancies. They wrote everything down, their pens scratching in their small notebooks. Agent Carr explained the meticulous chain of custody required for the vial of ricin. He asked if my mother had any background in chemistry, any access to laboratories. I had to sign a mountain of consent forms, granting them access to my entire life, my bank records, my emails, my phone logs. Detective Haynes warned me that they would likely uncover more fraud than Mason had found, and that I needed to prepare myself for the full scope of my mother's betrayal. When I was finally released from the examination room, I found my father in the waiting area. He was oscillating between a white-hot rage at Mason and a profound, shell-shocked disbelief about my mother. "She's my wife," he kept repeating, as if the words themselves could somehow negate the monstrous reality we had been plunged into. The burn surgeon delivered the prognosis. My mother was in critical condition, in a medically induced coma to manage the pain and the high risk of infection. We couldn't see her. Detective Haynes sat with us, outlining the legal labyrinth that lay ahead. Mason was facing, at minimum, charges of aggravated assault, but more likely attempted murder. If my mother survived, she would face a battery of federal charges for the ricin, on top of state charges for identity theft and her own count of attempted murder. It was a dizzying, incomprehensible tangle of jurisdictions and felonies. My uncles arrived to drive me home. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by a vapid pop song on the radio that felt like an obscenity. My apartment, my sanctuary, felt alien. Every photograph of my mother and me, smiling together, now seemed like a grotesque mockery, a prop from a meticulously crafted lie. I stared at my high school graduation photo, the one where we looked so alike, where people had called us twins. The resemblance that had once been a source of pride now felt like a curse. I sat on my couch, still in the paper scrubs from the hospital, and tried to wrap my mind around the unthinkable. The woman who had taught me to ride a bike, who had braided my hair before my first day of school, had been systematically stealing my identity for 3 years. She had been practicing my voice, memorizing the intimate details of my life, all in preparation to murder me and take my place. And Mason, my quiet, loving Mason, had known. And he had decided that the only way to save me was to permanently destroy her ability to impersonate me. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I ignored it. In the kitchen, as I reached for a glass of water, I saw it. A yellow envelope on the counter, one I hadn't put there. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a mail forwarding confirmation from the U.S. Postal Service, dated 6 days ago. All my mail was being redirected to a P.O. box across town. The signature on the form was a perfect forgery of my own. I slid to the floor, my back against the cabinets, and began making calls. The bank confirmed 4 unauthorized withdrawals in the past month, each one just under the mandatory reporting limit. The credit card company found 3 new cards opened in my name, with thousands of dollars in charges at stores near that P.O. box. With every call, the financial violation deepened, another layer of betrayal unearthed. I had to defer my start at medical school. The dream I had worked for my entire life was now on hold, a casualty of my mother's twisted envy. The news had broken. Reporters were calling relentlessly. My social media was a toxic flood of messages from strangers and acquaintances, all demanding details. The video from the restaurant had gone viral. I watched it once, a form of self-torture. I heard my mother's screams, watched her face peel away, heard her confess her monstrous plan. The comments were a war zone of opinions. Mason was a hero. He was a monster. I was a victim. I was complicit. I deactivated everything. I started a notebook, as Detective Haynes had requested, documenting every strange memory, every unsettling detail about my mother's behavior from the past few years. Her insistence on having copies of my keys. Her obsessive questions about my friends, my professors, my passwords. The way she had started wearing her hair like mine, buying the same perfume, even practicing my laugh. The list filled pages, a horrifying chronicle of a plot I had been too blind to see. The next day, I found a voicemail from Mason, left hours before the dinner. His voice was frantic, terrified. "I found something, Beatrice," he'd said, "something terrible about your mother. You have to know before we see her tonight. Please call me." I'm so sorry for what I might have to do. At the station, Detective Haynes showed me the ATM footage. It was my mother, in my clothes, mimicking my every mannerism with a terrifying, studied perfection. She had become me. Agent Carr confirmed the ricin was highly concentrated, extracted from castor beans she had ordered online. Her search history revealed months of meticulous research into lethal doses and extraction methods. The spa weekend was to be my execution. My friends started calling, their own memories now cast in a sinister new light. My mother's constant presence at my doctor's appointments, her intrusive questions about my prescriptions, her unnerving ability to recite the names and life details of all my friends. The pattern was undeniable. She had been studying me, preparing to step into my skin. The investigation uncovered the full, horrifying extent of her crimes. The P.O. box had been rented for 6 months. The total financial fraud exceeded $60,000. When I finally saw her at the hospital, through a glass window, she was a figure swathed in white bandages, kept alive by a web of tubes and machines. There would be dozens of surgeries, but her face could never be fully reconstructed. Detective Haynes found years of emails on her laptop, a litany of bitter complaints about me, about the sacrifices she had made, about how she deserved to live the life I had. A victim services advocate named Nina Ortega became my lifeline, guiding me through the bewildering legal process, reminding me that my feelings of confusion, grief, and rage were all valid. Mason's arraignment was a surreal ordeal. He pleaded not guilty, his lawyer arguing that he had acted in defense of another. I couldn't look at him. The man who had saved my life had also committed a monstrous act of violence, and I didn't know how to reconcile those two truths. The investigation then turned to my father. Mason's final, cryptic warning had been about him. A search of old paperwork revealed that my mother had tricked my father into signing over power of attorney, giving her complete control of his finances and medical care. She had been systematically drugging him for years, switching his blood pressure medication with sedatives, keeping him in a state of confusion and fatigue to maintain her control. She had been slowly, quietly destroying him, too. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio files of her practicing my voice. Receipts for castor beans and chemistry equipment. Notes on testing the poison on pet store mice. She had been monitoring my father's every move with spyware, reading his texts, listening to his conversations, watching as he searched online for symptoms of the dementia she was inducing. I arranged a visit with Mason in jail. Through a plexiglass barrier, he showed me the secret surveillance footage he had collected from my parents' house. I watched my mother crush pills into my father's coffee. I watched her switch his life-saving medication with sleeping pills. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. My father was hospitalized, suffering from seizures as the doctors carefully weaned him off the cocktail of drugs my mother had been feeding him. As the chemical fog lifted, a new man emerged, sharper, more alert, a man I had never truly known. He grieved for the years he had lost, for the wife who had never really existed. The legal battle was a marathon. 2 separate trials. My mother pleaded not guilty, her eyes burning with hatred from behind her bandages. My father filed for divorce. Mason eventually took a plea deal, 7 years in prison. My mother, facing a mountain of evidence and the prospect of life behind bars, also took a deal, 15 years in a federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10. At her sentencing, she remained defiant. "I gave up everything for my daughter," she said, her voice a rasp from her reconstructed throat. "I don't apologize for trying to take what was mine." The year that followed was a grueling process of rebuilding. I worked with specialists to reclaim my stolen identity, a bureaucratic nightmare of new social security cards, new passports, new bank accounts. My father and I cleaned out her belongings from the house, unearthing more of her creepy study materials, photographs of me covered in her handwritten notes, deconstructing my every gesture and expression. A year after the attack, I walked back into my medical school. The whispers and stares followed me, but I held my head high. I had survived. I had reclaimed my name, my future. The scars, both visible and invisible, would always be there. But from the shattered pieces of my old life, I was determined to build something new, something that was truly my own.